Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Secretary, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me on.
We talked in April, and I would love to get where you think we are now when it comes to the negotiations between the United States and China on a trade deal. After US and Chinese officials conducted talks for 2 days in London earlier this week, Commerce Secretary Lutnick announced that they have a quote, handshake for a framework to implement the Geneva Consensus that was agreed upon last month. President Trump posted Thursday that the China deal is great. So, can you share your thoughts on how you view this deal?
Well, as far as I can tell, it isn't really a big deal. It basically is dealing with export controls, and it essentially takes us back to where we thought we were several weeks ago when the president first announced that he thought he had a deal with China. So it's progress in the sense that in between, they went away from what we thought was the deal. Now, this time, I noticed they have still cautioned that it remains subject to approval by President Xi. As far as I know, that approval has not been forthcoming.
And as you and I sit here, I too haven't seen the approval from President Xi. Markets have had what has been described as a cautious reaction to the announcement of a framework or handshake for a framework. And Commerce Secretary Lutnick described this as putting meat on the bones of the Geneva Agreement that was reached back in May. So, you were former Commerce Secretary. If you were Commerce Secretary right now, what do you make of this? You're saying it's limited progress, but how does this move the needle?
Well, I think the trade offs between us relaxing our export controls a little bit, but not for the very, say, high end semiconductors, and permitting Chinese students to go to American universities. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. There are several hundred thousand, I think somewhat over 400,000 Chinese students last term were in our schools, and they mostly all pay full tuition. So if we knock that out, it would be very serious economic problem for those universities. And the president has said that he's okay with the idea of Chinese students in our schools. So while that's a new element, I don't see it as being particularly troublesome. I think what is trickier is this most recent request that the Chinese have made. Now they want to know all the end uses of the rare earths that we will be getting from them. Now that's a new request, and I think it's not a very satisfactory one because many of these rare earths are used for very advanced military purposes. So I don't see any earthly reason why we should give them that information. And further, it feels a little like it's an excuse to still delay and an excuse not to give full waivers of their own export control. So I'm not at all sure that as we get more into the details, that they're really giving us as much as it was implied in the beginning.
Let's talk about those details a little further. I want to read what President Trump posted. He said this about the deal, quote, our deal with China is done, subject to final approval with President Xi and me. Full magnets and any necessary rare earths will be supplied up front by China. Likewise, we will provide to China what was agreed to, including Chinese students using our colleges and universities, which has always been good with me. We are getting a total of 55% tariffs. China is getting 10%. Relationship is excellent. You were Commerce Secretary in President Trump's first term. You hear those details of the deal. Are you happy with them? What else are you going to the negotiating table with China about?
Well, the other issue with China and to some degree with all trade agreements is enforcement and punishment if the other party doesn't live up to the agreement. And that is a serious issue with China. Remember, we spent about 2 years negotiating the Phase 1 agreement, which was a much bigger deal, covered a lot more areas than this, but they never implemented it. And they just seem to ignore that fact. So I think an agreement is really only useful if you have a way to enforce its implementation. And when I hear them now saying that they want to know what are the end uses, that seems to me to be too much giving them judgment to still be able to withhold. And that to me is problematic. What we need is a clean deal on the rare earths, that we use them wherever we're going to use them and where they don't have an excuse. Well, I'm not sure about this end use or that. It's too easy if we give people some sort of discretion. It's too easy to let them use that as a blocking mechanism. And it feels a little to me like that may be what they're really up to here.
Do you think there will be the chance that there will be a clean deal when it comes to those rare earths? Because President Trump said our relationship now with China is great. Do you believe that? Do you think there's trust here, mutual trust right now between the United States and China when it comes to trade?
Well, trust comes as a result of performance. So far, we haven't seen performance on their part.
So then my next question would be what exactly are you looking out for next? Because President Trump said the deal was done. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick used different language. He said it's a handshake for a framework. I mean, what questions do you still have? What unresolved matters would you like to see tightened up?
Well, until you have a final formal agreement that's clear and enforceable and has penalties for failure to perform, you don't really have much of anything. A framework, what does that really mean? That really just means we have more work to do to make a definitive agreement. So it's a nice, maybe a nice start, but I don't think this is anything close to a final deal.
I feel really lucky being able to talk to you right now, a former Commerce Secretary. If you used the term a handshake for a framework, I mean, is that a lot of talk for really nothing? I mean, why the big announcement when there doesn't seem to be any new details from the agreement from last month?
Well, so far, their behavior in the talks and externally has not really been consistent with true negotiation. You'll notice they've been taking many more menacing steps in the Pacific Ocean, particularly at the remote islands of Japan, and they're continuing to buzz Taiwan. So I don't really see that those actions are consistent with saying we're going to tone things down. In addition, we've had this other problem of now three Chinese nationals trying to smuggle in very dangerous materials that could be very hurtful to our agriculture. Is I certainly don't know for sure that those people were sent by the Chinese government, but your average young person doesn't really go around the world with dangerous fungus and trying to smuggle it in. And we've now seen at least three instances of it. So that also is not very consistent with a toning down. And finally, they've repeatedly promised us that they would do something about fentanyl. As far as I can tell, there has been no tangible change in what they've been doing to try to help us avoid their fentanyl.
That's a really good point, and I'm curious, do you think that that was brought up in these negotiations? The fact that there were three Chinese nationals found to be smuggling in, allegedly, this dangerous fungus. Do you think that the American side should have brought that up and did bring that up? And then on the other side, do you think China has any leverage here in these negotiations when it comes to a federal court ruling that the tariffs are unlawful? I know that the appeals court said that the tariffs can stay in place through July.
Well, rare earths are their best leverage because they know that while we're finally moving to try to develop our own reserves, and the strange thing about that is rare earths are really not that rare. What has happened, and we have plenty of them. The problem is they show up in very small traces in very large bodies of ore that are totally unrelated. So it's very hard to extract them and it's somewhat pollutive. And one of the reasons that President Biden and others were reluctant to have us develop our own reserves was the pollution. But I never understood their position in that these earths are being processed. They're just being processed in China. And from a global point of view, it really doesn't make any difference in overall pollution if it's created in China or if it's created in the US. So I frankly thought that was a very silly argument against them. But what they also have done, they have driven the price of processing down to the point where it's uneconomical for an American supplier to process them. So the solution is our government needs to be prepared to subsidize that activity and subsidize it on an ongoing long term basis because this need is not going to go away. We need it for the magnets that are used in all kinds of uses. A large number of them are used in normal automobiles, but rare earths are also important to certain semiconductors and to all sorts of weapons used in our defense system. So the strange thing is the dollar value of these items is pretty small. I don't think it's $200 million is our total need. And so it's an ideal thing for China to withhold in that it doesn't change their GDP very much. So it's something that they can withhold without any big consequence to themselves.
So, the rest of the world this week saw the world's two largest economies reach a handshake for a framework of an agreement when it comes to a trade deal. And we see that the July 9th deadline is looming here. If I'm one of those other countries negotiating with the United States, I mean, what am I thinking? Where do you think that these other deals end up? Do you think they'll more quickly fall in place? with this limited progress we're seeing between the United States and China?
Well, as far as I know, there isn't even any discussion about further aspects of trade. Remember, one of our fundamental objectives is the elimination of non tariff trade barriers. They have some artificial barriers on our agricultural exports. Far as I know, they're not even discussing those. Similarly, if they wish to improve our trade balance, they could easily do so by buying more LNG from us. And that was part of what we had negotiated in the first Trump administration. I don't even hear any talk about that anymore. And that's what I meant when I said this feels like it's a very, very narrow definition of objectives. And so, and other than solving the rare earth problem, if it does, there's not much else we're going to get out of this.
How would you handle this differently then if you were Commerce Secretary right now?
Well, I don't want to second guess them because I don't know what's going on that hasn't been announced by either side. So, for all I know, there may be a whole parallel set of movement on other issues. But if the plan is just to solve these little bit issues and then say, well, now we're done with China, I don't think is a very complete solution. Now, if the end result is we solve this problem and we leave some of the bigger tariffs in place on China, that might be a pretty good substitute. I'm not at all convinced that we aren't better off without a trade agreement with them other than rare earths and possibly pharmaceuticals, and simply rely on tariffs.
China is arguably the most consequential trade deal that the United States has to hammer out. But there are also dozens of other countries that President Trump wants to reach a negotiation with. And he said that he's going to be sending letters out to other countries in about 2 weeks, quote, telling them what the deal is. What do you make of that strategy?
Well, I don't think that a trade deal that just deals with export controls could possibly be viewed as a major event. It's a good event and it's something we need, but it doesn't address the overall problem, doesn't address abuse of intellectual property, doesn't address spying. Remember, they floated those balloons over us. They're doing all sorts of spying things. So it doesn't deal with a huge number of issues. Now, if they at the end of the day announce, okay, that's what comes next, then that's fine. You can't solve all the problems in the world in 10 minutes, but I'm not aware that they have any program for further discussions of other topics.
To your point, it seems like what was being discussed was very narrow. How long do you think that it typically takes to hash out all of these details that you want to see in place?
Well, trade deals by their nature are very complex, and the exact wording of the agreements is very, very critical. But if the parties don't really intend to live up to them, and if there isn't a real mechanism for making them do so, then the agreement isn't worth anything. For example, look at the old deal that not Trump, but prior presidents had negotiated with Iran. As far as I can tell, they didn't live up to it. So what's the point having a deal with someone if they don't even live up to it?
Well, Secretary, what specifically are you looking out for next then? Because we have a lot of trade and tariff deadlines coming up.
Well, I think there are several good candidates for more comprehensive deals. I think Japan is a very good candidate. I think Vietnam is a good candidate. And India, they tend to move a little slowly, India is a good candidate as well. South Korea just elected a new chief executive, and we don't know yet what the implications of that might be for trade. But South Korea is another one that would be a logical uh, trade deal for us. And if you dealt with those few, plus Canada and Mexico, you really have the vast majority of our trade deficit taken care of anyway. So you don't need to have deals with all 70 countries. And I gather from what the president said the other day that with the lesser countries, he's simply going to announce what the tariffs are, and that's that. And if those are down uh, near the 10% level, that probably goes a long way toward meeting one of his objectives, which is raising federal revenue to try to offset some of the deficits that otherwise would be caused by the tax bill. So I wouldn't be surprised if, with many countries, he simply says, here's what we're doing, period. There is no more negotiating. That would be very time efficient because think about it, U.S. trade rep total staff is only about 200 people. Well, negotiating 70 very complex legal agreements with a staff of only 200 people, that's not a quick process. And even commerce, if you look at the part of the 40,000 commerce employees that are really involved in trade agreements, it's relatively small as well. So there's a bandwidth problem as to how many efforts we can undergo at the same time. And the one that I haven't mentioned, that in some ways is the most complicated, is the EU. What makes the EU very complicated is that it's not really one entity as a practical matter. You have 27 member states, each one has a different set of trade agendas from the other. So it's very hard to work out what are the concessions all 27 want from us and what are the concessions all 27 would be willing to make to help us offset whatever concessions we make them.
To your point there are dozens of deals that have yet to be seen, hundreds of details that need to be hammered out. And as we see more details come to light and develop, I hope you can come back on and break them down with me and provide your commentary as well. Secretary Wilbur Ross, I appreciate the conversation. You're welcome back anytime.
Well, thank you. One thing that your viewers may want to do, if they'd like some background in how President Trump negotiates and some of the relationship factors between him and President Xi, would be to buy my book. I published a book called Risks and Returns, a good portion of which covers those topics, not the current negotiations, but very good background that I think will give your viewers an insight into the U.S. side of the negotiation.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.